Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist behind the Lonesome Hunters at Dark Horse. It's Tyler Crook. Thanks for coming on out, Tyler.
Hey, glad to be here.
So it's Friday, August 5th. This podcast will be going up on Monday. How are you doing? How's Friday going?
It's going okay. I am behind on everything I need to get done, but I have faith that maybe I'll get it done.
Are you working on 4 right now?
Yeah, I'm almost done with 4. I just have a few more days to go on it.
That's one of the things that I always think is really interesting is just kind of how these things get, I don't want to say paced out, but where you're at in your schedule as like the book's coming out. Because I think issue 3 for the Lonesome Hunters is coming out August 24th, I believe.
That sounds right.
Yeah, and then presumably number 4 would be coming out sometime in September, a month later. So you're like, Are you wrapping it up or are you just partway through it right now?
No, I'm wrapping it up. I'm like, well, I think I have like 5 more pages to paint.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got to do my lettering, my final lettering pass and all that jazz and get it all the files prepped. But yeah, about another week.
How far out do you normally need to be done for an issue? Like if it's coming out in like a month and a half, when do you try to be done with it? I mean, ideally you're done way ahead of time, right? But what's the pacing normally like for that?
I've gotten slower, but so like right now it takes me about 8 weeks to write and draw and paint an issue of the Lonely Hunters or the Lonesome Hunters. So it's like, so I need to be at least most of the way through issue 3 before issue 1 comes out in order to be able to get it. Cause like I finish, so like I said, I'll finish number 4 in about a week and then the files will get processed and sent to the printer. And it takes a couple weeks to go through that process, to get stripped it out. And so it's all
cascading deadlines.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that I try really hard not to think about it too much. I try to just think about like my deadline, and my editor just tells me like if I'm late or not, and I'm sort of like, oh yeah, good.
I have started with the most incredible place to start. Then, well, look, before we get into the nitty gritty details on the Lonesome Hunters, I did want to go back with you, just kind of go back to the beginning, kind of see where you came from on your path to this book. We'll start with the beginning. Like, what came first for you, comics or art? Was it simultaneous? Was it one first? What led you on this path?
It's probably simultaneous. Like, I think I was really into comics as long as I can remember. As soon as I could remember being able to read, I was like wanting to read comics. And I remember my mom really did not want me to read comics because they were, well, she didn't want me to read like Spider-Man, like superhero stuff because it was too violent. And I ended up reading a lot of like, Richie Riches and Caspers and, all those Harvey comic stuff. And then like I got really into art in the 3rd grade. There was a show called Secret City that was on, I think it was on PBS where I lived in the Bay Area at the time. And it was this dude, Commander Mark, who would teach you how to draw. And it was like, he had this really great like approach for teaching kids to draw. And I remember one day using, like he'd be like, I'm going to teach you how to draw in 3D. Ooh. And, he'd show you how to construct a cube. So it looked like you were looking at it from an angle or whatever. And I remember one day, this is a very formative memory for me, is I remember drawing a dune buggy using the principles that he had taught me.
Yeah.
And just being like, holy shit, this looks like a real dune buggy. And of course it it looked like a shitty drawing that a kid did, but it like, in my mind, I was like, wow,
you did it.
This is it. And so I've been chasing that high since I was 9 or whatever. And then, but the comics, like I really got into comics, a couple years after that, probably like 5th grade. Was when I got into it. And that was sort of like the age where I could actually take my allowance and ride my bike down to the 7-Eleven and buy comics without my mom telling me that I couldn't have Spider-Man. I could actually go get Spider-Man.
Yeah. It was your renegade phase of comics.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, this probably came later, but when I was looking through some of the influences you talked about, you were talking about more like kind of strip artists, like Milton Caniff and like people like that, and like people who really, I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think like a lot of times when people talk about influences, they always have this idea as to these like formative people my age probably are like Jim Lee, it's like, oh my God, Jim Lee's got to be your guy. You know, that's the thing. And obviously, like, Jim Lee was huge for people of my age, but at the same time, a lot of times when I talk to artists, you know, you hear about Leyendecker, or you hear about magazine artists who are like, or, you know, I mean, even like Norman Rockwell. You talk to like somebody like Sanford Green. Sanford Green's all about Norman Rockwell.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting how there's always this kind of like, I don't want to say disparity between like kind of what we expect for people, but when you talk to somebody like you, maybe it wasn't John Romita or somebody like that was huge for you. It was actually Secret City that was like really pushing you. It's you never really know where,
Yeah.
where those influences come from.
Yeah, and especially lately, I've been feeling like I'm not a fan of things the way a lot of my peers are.
Mm.
Like there's a lot of things that I feel like everyone I know, like in the industry, like was obsessed with, that I absolutely was not obsessed with. Like the artist that really got me, like, and it's funny because I didn't set out trying to emulate this in any way, but like Bill Sienkiewicz was huge for me when I was growing up. Just seemed like Electra Assassin is one of those books that I have read probably more times than I've read my own name or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like that sort of stuff, but also like it's really funny the way Milton Caniff has been a huge influence on me, and the way I actually got there was really funny because I was watching Pulp Fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a scene in there where a kid is watching TV, and it's a cartoon, but it's one of those cartoons where it's like a drawing of a character, and then the lips are live action and they're superimposed over.
Okay.
I can't remember the name of the cartoon now.
Oh God, I remember it, and I remember being horrified by it.
Yeah, it was really wild. So like in my late 20s or early 30s, I got really curious about that, and I hunted it down, and I found actually I don't think I have it anymore, but I had a DVD of all of those cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at those. I'm like, these drawings are just gorgeous.
Yeah.
And then I sort of realized that they were doing, so I Googled it or whatever and looked it up and found out that they were doing a riff on Milton Caniff's style.
Wow.
And so I'm like, who's Milton Caniff? And, so I got there not through comics, but through watching Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is you never really know where these influences are going to come from, because it's like you could go back and you could look at these things in like books or whatever, and maybe they impact you, but sometimes it's that sporadic stuff that you can't really predict.
Yeah.
Well, you were interested in this stuff, you were drawing yourself, you were interested in comics. What made you want to become an artist for your actual career? And initially, did you have designs on being a comic artist, or was it more a general sense of the role?
Yeah. Well, a comic artist is one of those jobs that like I had wanted to do since I was a kid, and I could just never really like figure out how it was done.
Right.
But I always wanted to be an artist for a job. I have a cousin who, when I was, like in junior high, he was going to the art center in Pasadena, and we visited him a couple times, and he showed us the campus, and then he went on to work at Hallmark and stuff, doing illustration stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like, for me, that was a path. Like I wanted to get into commercial art was my mantra as a kid, was like, I want to be a commercial artist. Because it meant artist, but you made money.
Right, exactly.
It's like
both worlds.
that's perfect. So like I always wanted to do that, and then by the time I was ready to go to college, I had it in my mind that I would be sort of a fine art painter sort of thing. But I went to art school for a semester and basically dropped out because I couldn't afford it. And I managed to get a job doing graphic design stuff, and basically just built, like I sort of leapfrogged from career to career doing that. Like I started doing graphic design for print and stuff. And then I was doing, I started off doing pre-press, just setting up files to go to the printer and stuff. And then I was doing graphic design, and then I was doing web design. And then I started doing video game stuff. And I did all sorts of stuff for video games before I finally managed to get into comics.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I'm sorry to jump in, but I read about the video game thing, and I know this is terrible. I read this interview where you were talking about, you're like, I worked on some good games, but I also worked on some bad games, and those were mostly sports games. And I also read that you worked on the NFL Game Day franchise, which I loved when I was growing up. And so I was like, oh my God, I got to ask Tyler about it. And then I read the other interview where he said he didn't really like the sports games. So I was like, the one I liked, he didn't like. But I do have to ask, you worked in the video game space for a while. It was like 12 years from what I understand.
Yeah.
What were you doing in that space?
I did a lot of stuff. So I started out doing like interface design stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got into doing the 3D modeling. So I started off on a game that was like it was a roller derby game.
Okay.
That sort of got canceled in the 12th hour, like just before I was ready to, start testing or whatever. They canceled it. So that one I was doing mostly like illustration stuff for the interface and doing some like interface design stuff on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then for game day, I started doing stadium modeling. So I'd model where the game took place and doing that stuff. And I did that for a couple of years. And then they sort of moved me into doing character modeling for that. So I did character modeling. And then I moved into the 3D scanning department and worked with them and with the mocap department to do some sort of R&D types of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then me and some buddies quit Sony together and started our own company.
Wow.
And I was doing modeling and animation for that. And then I just never made any money doing that. It cost me more money than I made to do that. So then when I finally quit, in fact, it was really funny. When I was doing that, I had this notion in my head that like, okay, we're going to start this video game company. We're going to make a ton of money.
Mm-hmm. I'm
going to cash out. And then I'm finally going to be able to draw comic books.
Yeah.
And so when I basically ran out of money and had to declare bankruptcy, I'm like, you know what? I should just draw comic books anyway, because like
I'm already there.
Just go ahead and do the thing, like, instead of fucking around with all this other stuff. And so that's how I started. How I made the transition was basically just deciding it was time to stop fucking around.
It's really interesting. You won the Russ Manning Promising Newcomer Award at the Eisners. Mm-hmm. And the fascinating thing about that, there's like a cognitive dissonance in there because you had like an entire career before then that just wasn't in comics.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that. It's your first big comic work was Petrograd over at Oni, a graphic novel you did with Philip Galat that earned you that aforementioned award at the Eisners. Mm-hmm. The thing that really blows me away about this is I know you draw on your own things and you probably noodle around with comics and stuff before, but this was your first published work. Well, I think it was maybe other things came first, but it was the first one you worked on. And it was an entire graphic novel. So it wasn't exactly starting with like the easiest path possible. But what was that experience like? Was it a lot of learning on the job, making up things as you were going along? Or did you feel that like you knew what you were doing from the jump?
Didn't I? I still don't feel like I know what I'm doing. So like it was definitely learning on the job. Like I started off, like I've said this before, but I think that if I understood what it would take to draw Petrograd, I don't know if I would have done it, because it was, I don't know if I would describe it as being like grueling or like especially difficult, but it was just such a big job. I mean, it took 2.5 years. Yeah. And it took so much sort of focus and commitment to be like, to go do my day job, work that for 8 to 10 hours a day, and then come home and do a couple hours on Petrograd, like every single day and every weekend. And if I had really understood what it would have taken, I don't know if I would have been. I think it would have scared me off if I had understood what it would take to do that.
I remember this one creator, and it was like an up and coming creator at the time, told me this story about how he talked to Steve Lieber at a convention, and he was telling Steve about how he was working on this like magnum opus, and it was like this massive graphic novel and all this stuff like that. And Steve listened to him and he was like, you should do something smaller first. So you can figure out like exactly what you're doing before you take on your magnum opus. And I think that person was like, I think he's right. And like decided to like audible and do something different. And unfortunately you did not. So you were working at the same time as doing Petrograd.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was it still in video games or was it something else?
Yeah, it was still in video games. I'd gone back to Sony actually as a contractor and was working there at the time.
That's crazy. I mean, talk about degrees of difficulty. So your first published work, it's an entire graphic novel. You're doing it as you're moonlighting away from your day job. And I don't know if there's any other difficulties, but I got 3 at least, and that's a lot. Also, you're drawing comics, which is incredibly difficult to begin with.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's funny. Like I don't know how else I could have done it though.
That's true.
You know, like because there wasn't anything. Well, I guess I was lucky also that I was working with Phil Gillette because that was he had, you know, I had an entire script when I started, which if I was having to like start from a blank page, I don't know if I would have ever, you know, been able to make it. But having like the whole story in front of me and knowing like from A to B where I needed to go, like that made it way more doable. And actually having an editor
Right.
and a collaborator at the same time, like having those things was so helpful. I mean, Jill Beaton was my editor at Oni, and I wouldn't have been able to get it done without her because she just, and it was just like feeling like I would turn things in every 2 weeks or so and be like, here's like 5 more pages, here's a couple more pages and stuff. And that having that sort of accountability was really helpful for doing it.
Yeah, I mean, you did like a semester of art school. In some ways, though, I imagine the 2.5 years of Petrograd was like art school in its own right.
Oh, for sure. Like that was definitely like that was where I learned to draw comics, was doing that big comic. Then working on B.P.R.D was a whole nother learning experience too. Like that had a lot of you know, I got to get paid to learn how to do that, which is not something I'm super grateful for that, you know.
I was going to bring that up. So next up, you had some guest issues of the Six Gun, I think, which, you know, I have to say you very much fit with Brian Hurt stylistically, like very nicely. Yeah. Obviously, because you're still working with him. But after that, you became the person who first tackled B.P.R.D after Guy Davis left. You know, we talked about this via email. I was one of the Mignolaversity people over at Multiversity Comics, and I was a massive Guy Davis mark, as many were.
Yeah, me too.
That was like, I mean, following him is going to be tough for anybody, but you did an amazing job. You're learning there too. You're continuing to learn in a different way over in the Mignolaverse with B.P.R.D. But was there any intimidation following Guy, or is it just something that you kept out of your brain because you were already just like, I'm trying to figure this out as I'm doing it?
Yeah, it was super intimidating. And yes, I had to like force it out of my brain and just try not to do it, like not to think about, you know, that end of it. Because I mean, Guy Davis is still one of my favorite cartoonists of all times. And it actually, and good for him that he's doing all that movie stuff nowadays. But it breaks my heart that like we don't get more comics from him. Yeah, because he's like one of the great talents, I think, of our age or whatever. So yeah, it was pretty stressful. And in fact, I've never actually even really spoke to him. We exchanged like a message on Twitter at one point, and I was just like, I'm nervous, and he's like, you'll do great. And that was sort of it.
You know, obviously you're working with Mignola on that, and John Arcudi, an incredible writer.
Love that dude.
Very, very thoughtful writer, and somebody who really considers his artist and everything like that. What did you learn doing that? Like, did that feel like was that like the graduate level of school, or are you just kind of always at the graduate level of school at this point?
Well, I never made it to graduate level of school, so I don't know exactly what that is. But it was like, well, I don't know. My feelings about my B.P.R.D work is like, I'm really, really proud of the work that I did, but I don't feel like I really hit the mark on anything for B.P.R.D until probably the very last issue I did.
Was it Grind? Was it 124?
Yeah.
That's my favorite issue. One of my favorite issues in the entire series.
That's like every time I talk to Arcudi, we sort of were like, wow, we should have done Grind first, because that was where like we finally like synced up perfectly, I think, with that issue. And yeah, I don't know. The whole thing with B.P.R.D was that I always felt like I was over my head on that project. Like I didn't ever feel like I was nailing anything. And you know, and it didn't help that there was dudes like
James Herron
coming on. As soon as I saw his like his Abe Sapien book thing, I was like, man, they're gonna fire me. They're just gonna fire me and hire this dude to do the whole thing.
That was a really fascinating time. I was actually looking through like the list of the artists that were working during that period, and replacing Guy Davis is tough, but like having you and like James Herron, and then like I think like Duncan Fegredo did like one quick arc, and like Max Fumara and a bunch of other people. It's like did a pretty good job. There's a lot of talent in there, and like James was that was like the first time I'd come across James's stuff too, and then seeing him work on that stuff was pretty crazy. But yeah, I mean that's always tough. I mean like the comparison game is always difficult. But like I said, that grind. It was funny because in the Mignolaversity stuff, I actually went back and looked at my review, and I was like, did I like that as much as I said I did? And we used to do these like discussion reviews where we go back and forth. And I told my collaborator on that one, Brian Salvatore, I told him, I was like, this was one of the most remarkable issues of B.P.R.D. in a long time. And the reason why I loved it so much, and I think part of the reason maybe why it spoke to you to a certain degree, is like the horror was baked into like the minutia of reality, where it was just like this guy who works in a coffee shop who just lives with this all these like crazy monsters around him, and like his neighbor is like baked into the wall with monsters all over him. He has to go to or try to go to sleep with all this happening around him. And it's like all about like the hope coming and then being torn away on like this very like street level view. And I don't know, I mean that story seems to fit you better than like some of the other stuff. Like I like love The Devil's Engine, but that's just like a road trip arc with like a train and all kinds of monsters everywhere. I feel like the pacing of Grind kind of matches your sensibilities a little bit more.
Oh, for sure. Like I think that that sort of street level stuff is always what I'm attracted to. Like I want stories that are about people, and less about the monsters, really.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. Macroverse is a next-generation digital comics platform, and one with an astonishing number of comics, with currently over 50 series from over 100 creators on their app, with a 5-star rating both on Apple and Google's app stores. Download the app and binge all their titles, including the Eisner-nominated Remind from Jason Brubaker, Lisa K. Weber's Hex 11, which has been described as Harry Potter meets Blade Runner, or the new queer supernatural adventure series Husk that launches on November 1st. It's just $4.99 a month to subscribe to Macroverse, with proceeds directly supporting the creators on the platform. Keep an eye on the future of Macroverse too, as 2022 is going to bring an epic upgrade that offers a new level of digital collectability and more, with early adopters able to sign up for more information at macroverse.com. And now, back to the show.
We're here to talk about The Lonesome Hunters, your current 4-issue miniseries at Dark Horse, in which you write, draw, color, letter, and provide covers for each issue. Here's the solicit. An old and out-of-practice monster hunter in hiding crosses paths with a young girl that forces him to confront these chaotic creatures. As the beasts invade their tenement, they set off on a supernatural road trip to stop these ancient evils, in a story that explores the ways that youth informs adulthood and how early traumas can haunt us in an old age. I like the fact that, I mean, we're going to get into the magpies later, but I love the fact that, like, as the beasts invade their tenement, and we're talking about magpies. It is amazing. Anyways, I love you sent me the first 3 issues. I absolutely loved it. This comic genuinely rules. I've read the first 3 issues multiple times, and each is absolutely exemplary. Let's start at the beginning, though. From what I understand, this started a long, long time ago. Even before you worked on Witchfinder in the broader Mignolaverse, like, so around like 9 or 10 years ago. We know that Lonesome Hunters is rooted well in the past, but do you remember what it started with? Because in my mind, I'm thinking about the important elements. There's like the main 2 characters, Howard and Lupe, and then there's the sword, and then there's like the broader historical elements of it. There's a lot of places you could start. Do you remember where it started specifically?
Yeah, I actually remember the exact thing that sparked the idea, and it was an ad that I saw for Amnesty International.
What?
That had Patrick Stewart in it.
Okay.
And it was like a print ad or an internet ad, and it was Patrick Stewart, and he's holding a grocery bag in one hand and a protest style sign in the other hand.
Mm-hmm.
And the sign says like "Stop Violence Against Women" or something like that. And he's sort of just dressed in like a leather jacket and jeans. He's like in street clothes. And I remember seeing that ad and being like, why is he holding that grocery bag? Because like it really just like, it looks like he was going shopping and he saw like an Amnesty International protest or demonstration thing and joined. It really, like, it's one of those things that just, I don't know why he had that shopping bag.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of like was one of those things that just started spinning in my mind. I'm like, okay, so what if he was a guy? Like, why would this old guy who cares about, domestic violence, like, what's his story? And I just started thinking about an old guy and like what he might be going through and stuff. And at the same time, we had just moved to Oregon, and we were about an hour and a half drive from Portland, and we were making that drive a lot. About once a week, we were driving into Portland, and me and my wife would brainstorm story ideas in the car, and that was sort of where a lot of this came from, was in those drives, just sort of like spitballing and coming up with ideas and stuff.
I could have guessed like a million different things, and I never would have come up with an Amnesty International ad with Patrick Stewart holding a grocery bag.
I wish I could remember where I had originally heard it, but I listened to an interview with a writer, and she was talking about how all of her novels stem from her trying to solve a mystery. And like she was describing a novel she had written that was based entirely on being in a bathroom at a rest stop, and this woman came in who was dressed like she had just come from a ball, but she was drunk and like stumbling through this rest stop bathroom. And this lady is like, what is this person's story?
Yeah.
And, like, had to like make up a story to solve that, that mystery. And I think this was sort of like that.
That's the thing about ideas is like, I've talked a lot on here with people about like ideas coming in the shower, or ideas coming like as you're mowing the lawn or whatever, when your brain's not thinking about it. But sometimes it's like outside stimuli that you don't really think about. Like I wrote a feature last year. No, it was earlier this year, because time is completely hard to track at this point.
Yeah.
I was listening to a song that had quotes from the movie Booksmart in it. And the quote from the movie Booksmart put an idea into my brain that eventually led to me writing basically how a comic was made from front to or from like the very beginning of the idea to the end of it, like with like extreme detail. And I would not have thought about doing that if it weren't for the fact that there was this random quote in this song and that just happened to hit me at the right time. And like, I mean, that's the thing is like especially for like that writer is talking about like, or like, what you're talking about the Amnesty International ad, it's like, what is the story of this person? Like, why are they doing this while, because the grocery bag to me is the most important part of that. It's like, that's, it's like injecting ordinary into the extraordinary.
Yeah.
Well, so you've described the Lonesome Hunters as Lone Wolf and Cub meets Preacher, which is an amazing combination. It's also incredibly accurate. The former is obvious. I mean, you have the older person who's experienced in all this, and then the younger person who kind of gets, pulled into all this with Howard and Lupe. I'm curious as to where the preacher part comes in. I mean, I have some ideas, but where does the preacher part enter into the equation for you?
Well, a lot of that has to do with the road trip. Like they're on a road trip, which is like most of Preacher, and two, there's a lot of Howard's backstory that is sort of built in having been a part of a I don't want to say cult, because that gets thrown around too sort of lightly, but it just sort of a non
aggressive church.
An aggressive church is probably, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, a church that does not necessarily have peace and love at its core.
I could also see like the blending of like reality with the fantastical. I mean, that also goes back to Patrick Stewart. But some of the stuff I really like in the book is some of those like really, I don't know, like these moments where it's like these people should be absolutely like out of their minds with just like, what in the hell is this world going on? But it's also just grounded in reality, because it's like you're on a road trip. What are you going to do? You're going to talk about, well, I mean, I think one of the things I think is really interesting about this book is like, despite the fact that there's like some horrific elements to it, there's like a lot of sweetness to it in some like interesting ways. Like, I don't want to get into it because it's a spoiler for issue 3, which isn't out yet, but there's a conversation in that issue between Lupe and Howard where the former is explaining Mecha Saber Gemini a show she loved from the 1980s, and Howard is like just enthralled. He is like so interested in this. And I don't know, this is kind of a weird thing to say, but it kind of reminds me of like the Preacher Cast in the idea that Lupe and Howard need each other to survive, but almost feels like they need each other to live as well. It's like they bring like the most out of each other in some ways, just in the same way that like Tulip and Jesse did.
Yeah, no, like I think that's when I figured out that I wanted to have Lupe in the story and, you know, do this lone wolf and cub thing. That was sort of like the thing that I wanted to get together. Well, you know, and I guess one of the other big influences on this book was my favorite novel, which is The Heart is a Lonesome Hunter, which is, you know, I obviously swiped the title, you know, but the in that book, like my interpretation of that book and why I think it's such a great novel is that it takes the, you know, there's about, you know, 6 or 7 characters, like main characters in that book, and they are all sort of profoundly lonely in their own special way. And so the whole novel is just like an examination of all these lonely people and the ways that they're working to connect. And so that was sort of my inspiration of like taking these 2 like profoundly lonely characters and letting them connect and seeing how these 2 people who are both just super lonely and are feeling very trapped in their lives, and how that they can, when they see each other and they meet, they sort of see in each other a way to not only get out of this trappedness of their lives, but also get out of their loneliness, you know? And it's one of those things that I like. I like seeing characters that actually like each other.
Yeah.
You know, I think too many people, well, I think a lot of stories sort of end up being centered on having characters that are in conflict with each other. And yeah, and I wanted to just have these 2 main characters be, you know, good for each other.
When you think about most like buddy comedies or buddy adventures, like two-handers, I guess you will, when you think about those, most often it's always like starts with a misunderstanding, then they're like kind of like butting heads throughout, but then by the end it's like the basically the finale equivalent of like the handshake from Predator that's very famous and memed up, where it's just like they finally like come around with each other. And I like that, like kind of from the beginning, it's like there's this moment in issue 2 where Howard's going to sleep on a couch and Lupe's sleeping on the floor, and she tells him that he was brave. And that was just like, it's just a really nice moment. But I think it's, you know, bringing up that part from issue 3, again, I'm not going to get into it too much, but it does underline something I think is really interesting about this is like, so at the very beginning of the story is like 100-ish years ahead of like where we're at in the story. And it begins with like Howard in his youth being pushed into like an absolutely unthinkable position of having to kill a demon with a magical sword by his father. And the actions of that day put him on this like path to a long lasting life, and one that's like destined to be filled with peril because he's got this terrible sword. And like that show discussion kind of underlined to me that like as Howard was listening to this and was getting really enthralled to it, like in some ways he's still kind of a kid. Like he didn't really have like his childhood. He's like kind of stuck in Arrested Development. Is that something that's of interest to you as a storyteller, like exploring what happens? Because like in some ways, like Howard is like a classic chosen one type. His dad told him he was destined for greatness because he's seen it. He's seen this like this idea, and he has to have this sword. And he's just like, I just want to go away. This sucks. Are you interested in exploring kind of what happens to these like chosen one types after they take on their destiny in their youth and then have this entire life to live after that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff at play in that. So like I was raised Mormon. We were Mormon until I was in my, you know, early teens, and then we stopped going to church. And in that church there is a thing that happens when you turn oh crap, I can't remember if it's when you turn 18 or 19, but you're basically given the priesthood, and you are you know, you're a man, but you're also like given a lot of spiritual and social capital. I mean, and if you're like especially conservative in the church, like they're guys where it's like as soon as you turn, as soon as you're given the priesthood, you can basically tell your mom what to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like you're her boss now, like, and so like that was sort of one of the things that I was thinking about is like being like what's the destructive part of that for a young man to be told like, oh, you're the boss now,
Mm-hmm.
when you're not like in any way the boss, you know what I mean? You're
Right.
just like a kid fucking around. I was also thinking, I had this notion in my head, well, it's not a notion, but like this feeling that when you, like the moment you become an adult is sort of the moment where you go, oh, wait, I'm just going to feel like a dipshit my whole life. Like
Yeah.
I'm never, like as soon as you sort of realize like, oh, I'm never going to get that like all knowing adulthood feeling that when I was a kid, I thought adults had. It's like, as soon as you like realize that this is it, then that's when you become an adult, because that's when you start dealing with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so like there was a lot of things about that were sort of involved in developing what Howard's deal is, because he was sort of like, and I guess the other thing I was thinking about a lot at the time was just like how you live with uncertainty, how you don't know like nothing about like all the big metaphysical questions that we live with, like we just will never know the answer to until after we're dead, and how you sort of like how do you live in that sort of situation. So I was sort of like processing all of that stuff and thinking about it, and then I sort of it sort of came together in the idea of how Howard was like given this sort of like prophecy, but the prophecy was basically just made up.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like his dad sort of had this idea and was like, oh, I have this idea, I think it's true, I'm going to force this idea on my kid. And the kid is like, now I have to do this thing that's not true. how do I deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was sort of where that came from.
Yeah. I mean, I love how you executed. Now, also, I don't know if it's because the dad is really like over the top and just kind of ridiculous in the beginning, but I have a very hot take for you about the opening of the book.
Okay, hit me.
The deer demon in the first issue, is it bad that I thought he was kind of like semi-reasonable? It was just like, I mean, like some of his stuff where he's just like, he just seems pretty like, I understand what's going on here. When he says, but I'm so weary of the churn, and he's like, I'm just going to like blow this place up. I'm just like, it's rational takes by this deer demon. Good job by you. I mean, he doesn't survive seemingly, but at the same time, when I was reading it, I was just like, this guy doesn't seem so bad. I do want to talk about Howard and Lupe in specific. Howard, you've already talked about why he's like the fit, but why are they like the right leads for this story? How did you go from Patrick Stewart to like this kind of, road trip story about these two figuring things out together?
I don't know.
It was just the answer.
Lupe, yeah, it was sort of just what Lupe was hard. Was hard for me to get to come up with that, with her as a character, and it took me a long time. I think because I think Howard, that character sort of jumped into my head pretty fully formed right off the bat, and then once I decided that he needed somebody to talk to,
right,
and it needed to be somebody who was simpatico but also different from him, like was coming at problems from a different perspective than him.
Mm-hmm.
Then that was basically what led me down the thing. And it's such, and she started off being a lot more sort of punky sort of a character, and slowly changed until like I had her, she's wearing her hoodie all the time, and has that sort of protectiveness that a lot of teen girls have, where they're they dress in very baggy clothes and are like very sort of closed in,
mm-hmm.
like when they're in public, and I wanted to sort of give that a chance to because everyone likes to make teenage girls those well, I don't know if that's quite like manic pixie dream girls, but they always want to make them like, bubbly and silly and stuff. And I wanted to make a character that was more like the my friends in high school who were not like super bubbly and silly.
Yeah. Yeah. They're the type who would, won't take shit from anybody. Like, I got to give her credit. That's another thing that's a nice balance. Like, that's one thing I think is really great about Howard and Lupe is they balance each other out really well, because they, it's like Howard's in a situation where he's in danger and he's like, not sure if he really is like going to swing this sword, and all of a sudden like Lupe shows up and just starts throwing stuff at a demon magpie, and you're just like, yeah, these two balance each other out. But they also, I mean, it's good because you have that balance, but also like the connection in the sense that they kind of have both had personal tragedies that they've went through. It's like they're like they have that natural bond, and also the fact that they don't really have anyone else at this point. That's such a good connection.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. It's Bad Idea still. I have good news. They got back to me on a script for an ad. I also have bad news. They told me to come up with it because they're busy baking. So I hear they're making donuts now? I don't know what's going on. Bad Idea is over. Let's get back to the podcast.
I was surprised when it was revealed. I don't think this is a spoiler. I think it's like a interesting hook to the story. I was surprised when it was revealed about halfway through the first issue or so that it was Lupe that was the one that was narrating it. It's like, and also it kind of has like an omniscient nature. She's narrating from the future or a present that's ahead of this story at the very least. I'm interested in like what made that the right choice. Like, why did you want to use a narrator for this and that sort of narrator as well?
Well, I think that having a narrator helps the story, especially like in a 22-page comic book, to actually get like the story rolling. Having a narrator is like sort of technically a very helpful thing. But I think that like narrators really only work when there's a distinct voice to them. And, you know, we did that like in Harrow County, we have a narrator, even though that's basically an omniscient narrator. It still comes with a voice. You know what I mean?
Right.
In fact, when I read those, I always imagine the voice of the narrator for Dukes of Hazzard. Like that's the voice in my head
Harrow
when I
County?
read those. For Harrow County, yeah.
I would not have. That is as unexpected as Patrick Stewart in an Amnesty International commercial.
Yeah, that's like the Duke boys are headed to a wedding, sort of a voice.
Oh my God, I love it.
So so with this, I was like, I spent a little bit of time thinking about like how I could get this narration to feel like it was coming from a perspective, and I liked sort of the way it, because so much of the story is about like the past and how it affects the present and how it leads to the future. And I think that having not only flashbacks, but then we see the present, but then we also have the narration that is presumably from the future.
Right.
Gives us a great way to get some more depth and insight into that.
I mean, you talked about this already, but I love the personality in it. There's like the amazing page turn where Lupe is telling the story of kind of how Howard got the sword and survived that crazy night. And then there's this like amazing establishing shot of where Howard is now. And it's like, and he got old. But like, you could have just stopped it there. But because Lupe is Lupe, she adds, really old.
Yeah. Well, and also he is really old. He's much older than he looks, even.
And he looks pretty old.
Yeah.
I mean, I gotta say, tough break for Howard. You get eternal life, but you still kind of like age incrementally. So he's just like, he's really old for a very long time. That's kind of I mean, he's not quite I think that whether or not he's immortal is up to debate, like early in the story. But it says, what is it? Whoever held the sword was given supernaturally long life, maybe even immortality. I don't know if I'd want immortality if I was perpetually like 90.
Aging.
Yeah. That's not an ideal form of it.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't either. That's right. This is unrelated, but well, I guess it's related, but I always thought that Yoda, when I was a kid, I thought that Yoda was a human because he introduces himself and he's like, I'm 700. And I was like, oh crap, that's what a human looks like when they're 700?
I don't want to be 700.
Like if you draw a straight line from like being 30 to being 100 to being 700, it's like, yeah, that tracks. Like you just keep shrinking.
Yeah.
And your ears keep getting bigger.
Oh my God. You know, it's funny because in Star Wars, George Lucas has always never allowed other people, or previously had never allowed people to tell the story of Yoda. And they're like, we've never seen other versions of, I mean, obviously now we've seen a baby version, which has totally ruined your theory, of course. Up until Grogu, though, I would have totally bought into what you're saying because, like, maybe the reason why we've never seen anyone else from his species is we are his species. We just slowly get greener and smaller and more gigantic eared.
Yep.
That's amazing. The other lead, in some ways, is the sword.
Yeah.
Why was the sword the important third ingredient to the story? And like, was it there before you had Howard and Lupe, or did it come as a product of them?
Came as a oh man.
Like you needed a reason for
Yeah,
Howard to be that old.
I think and I needed like I needed a plot, you know what I mean? Like I had these two characters that I really liked, and I needed something for them to do. And having a magical sword that like everybody's after is a great sort of, you know, I don't know if that would be considered a MacGuffin, but it's like a great
it's a connective tissue.
Yeah.
It's like the thing that they share that brings them together for the first time. I think a MacGuffin has to be, wait, is MacGuffin the one where it's like the thing that orients the plot? And I guess this doesn't really orient the plot so much as just like gives them something to intermittently whack magpies with as like as a big queen monster wants to take it away from them. I could be a MacGuffin.
But it's also the driver of sort of the larger story where it's, you know, they have this incredibly dangerous thing and Howard has never wanted it. And so they have to figure out like how they keep it, this thing that they don't want, safe, you know? So that's like the big motivator for like the overall arc. But then like that was one of those things where I'm like, okay, well, where did this sword come from? And I had to come up with a whole story for that. And that's, you know, that's going to be part of the larger arc too.
Yeah.
I mean, this is my first book writing. And, you know, you told the story from Steve Lieber about not writing your magnum opus. And I think I kind of threw that out the window for this one too, where I'm like, you know, I'm just going to do this huge story. And, you know, we got the first 4 issues approved. And I'm like, okay, I'll just do the story about how Howard and Lupe met. And then we can, you know, if that works out, we'll spin it into the, you know, the larger opus that I want to tell about it. Because the sword has a big, long history too that I have all, you know, worked out that I'm hoping we can tell.
I have to say, like, you know, going back to Grind, to the B.P.R.D issue that we talked about earlier, the thing that I think really works about it is about Lonesome Hunters is like you can feel like the history in the book, and you can feel the history in the characters and everything, but it still feels very grounded. Like, and I think that's really important in the same way that Grind does, because it's just like, you know, Howard is a very old man, and he's in a lot of ways just an ordinary old man. Like when he turns and yells at the kids on like the stoop of the apartment building, he's just like, damn kids, and they all just laugh at him. He's still got kind of like traditional old man problems, but he also has like, I have to intermittently get roped into this business with these like ultra powered like magpies and everything. It's a really nice balance to it, and it like allows, I don't know, I mean, like that's one of the things I think is interesting is like you can see how this could get a lot bigger, but you can also see how it just works on an incremental like story by story basis.
Well, and that's what is really like always compelling to me about stories is just when I don't find myself motivated by like when I'm reading a story or watching a movie, it's like nothing, all of the cool shit that goes down and like everybody's like, I don't know, all the stuff that happens really is always secondary to me to like what the human experience is and what happens. And I think, you know, I think that's in Harrow County too. Like that's so much of that story is always just coming down to like, what are these people feeling as they're going through these things, you know? And one of the things about like superhero comics, like I don't read a ton of superhero comics anymore.
Sure.
And, but I would, if they would just fucking cry.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I wish like Captain America would be like, you know, fighting some giant dude and like crying the whole time because it's hard.
Yeah.
What he's doing is really hard. And he should be like losing his mind over this. And, you know, they always try to keep him just stoic and, you know.
Daredevil should be crying like 100% of the time.
Oh my God.
His life is horrible.
Like every X-Man should just be like, you know, a puddle of tears through the whole thing.
Yeah. I'm like Jean Grey. I'm like, I've died like 13 times.
Yeah.
What is my life?
Yeah.
Yeah, there should be a lot of I don't know. They're going through stuff all the time, but yeah, I could totally see that.
And that's something with you know, the Lonesome Hunters in particular. I'm really trying to do is make sure that like these traumatic things that happen actually have
weight,
and they have, you know, there's a cost to it. Like there's a human cost to these characters where like they go through. And in the first issue, Lupe's uncle, well, I don't know how spoiler I get, but what happens to her uncle is very, very traumatic, you know? And I want that to have like to show that trauma and show that weight to it. Because I think, I don't know, man, I've been thinking a lot about how stories don't serve us as well as they should a lot. And
in what sense?
In the sense that they don't reflect what it would be like to have something happen. You know what I mean? Like, so often, things like death and stuff are dealt very laissez-faire in a lot of storytelling. And when that stuff happens in real life, it is awful, and I would like to see that reflected a little bit more.
I think it's interesting. A lot of stories orient around plot above all. And it's like things happening. Yeah. And when things happening is the priority, it's hard to deal with the ramifications of those things happening. And a lot of times that's A, what is interesting, and B, what's relatable in a story. Like what allows you to see yourself in the story. And I think both of those things are important. And it's interesting that, like, I don't know. That's part of the reason why I like the Lonesome Hunters so much is, like, it kind of, it's not so focused on the plot so much as it's focused on, like, how having a life like this and having those big plot things in your life would impact your actual life and how you feel and live as a person.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, real life doesn't have a plot. Like, it doesn't have a 3-act structure. It has, like, an ongoing falling down a hill, sort of a structure. I'm trying to get to that a little bit, but still have it be a satisfying story, which is a bit of a challenge.
It would be really horrible to have a 3-act structure to your life. There's like very long stretches of your life that would just be like horrible. I just think of Goodfellas when I think of the 3-act structure. And I just, like, I don't want to be in basically the last hour of that movie at any point in my life. No, thank you. No, thank you.
Yeah. Well, they're like real life 3-act structure in real life is like, oh, I should wash the dishes. You wash the dishes and you're like, the dishes are done. And then the 4th act is like, oh, look at all these other dishes I have to do now. Like, that's real life structure.
Well, okay, I do want to quickly talk about the villains of the story, which are the magpies. They are magpies who are incredible, I do want to point out. They wear, like, necklaces with treasures on them, and the treasures give them powers because that was, like, something people used to think, and it turns out that they don't necessarily like shiny things. They just like, basically... My household is a very pro-magpie one. We have a ton of magpies that come by, and they're very adorable in some hilarious ways because we've discovered that that magpies literally, they do not understand how to unshell peanuts. How to get the peanuts. Yeah. They'll stand, like, Stellar Jays will grab them and then they'll, like, eat the peanuts out of the shell, just, like, use their beak to open it up. And the magpies will just repeatedly stomp on them with their feet. And they're like, how do I open this? This is absolutely mystifying. And they're really hilarious. The ones in this are less hilarious. In some ways, they are actually. I like the one in issue 3, but from what I understand, they were there from the beginning, more or less. But I'm not interested in where they came from so much as, like, you had a lot of bird options. Like, you could have picked any bird. Why magpies?
I think it was the folk stuff about them collecting treasure and collecting shiny things. And sort of being like, why would they do that? And, like, to do magic is, like, a great answer for that. I think that's why magpies. Because I don't really have, like, a strong connection to magpies. When I was a little kid, we lived in Idaho, and I remember there were magpies up in the high desert kind of area. But I didn't, like, hang out with them or anything. I don't know. Like, I didn't, like, think about magpies at the time. So I don't know why magpies in particular. We have chickens. And we've had them for 3 or 4 years now, and I'm sort of obsessed with chickens. And actually, since having those, I've gotten very interested in birds just in general and stuff. They're really weird and funny animals.
Yeah. Birds are, I'm a very pro bird person. We have a lot of bird visitors here in Anchorage where I live. And, like, we have a bunch of bird feeders and everything. But magpies, despite what I said about not being able to figure out the peanuts, are smart as hell. And, like, it actually makes them, they're a reasonable villain, especially because I have 2 cats too. And they are, like, they bully my cats. They'll, like, do these, like, weird pincer attack moves so they can get to food where one will distract the cat. and then the one on the other side will go and get the food, and then they'll both bounce.
Mhm.
And the other thing too is like they're very famous because they never forget. Like if you wrong them, they will like chase after you for like basically the remainder of their life, which is horrifying but true. But
There's so much stuff. Man, do you want to talk about birds for just a
let's
second?
talk about birds. Let's do it.
Man, my chickens, when we got them, it's like, we bought them when they were from the, farm store, and they were literally a day old. And I just could not believe, you get them in the box and you look at them and they would look you in the eye. And I'm like, your brain is like the size of a pencil eraser, if that. And like, what are you trying to get from looking me in the eye? Like, what are you trying to read from that? And
they're reading your soul.
yeah, no, they're just they're way smarter. And then we have scrub jays here, like blue jays.
Yeah.
And I swear to God that there was one that would, I don't know where they were getting the peanuts, but they would get them and drop them in my yard just to watch my chickens run after it.
Oh my God.
Chickens would we had 2 chickens at the time, and like one of them would find the peanut and like, it was so funny. Like if they had just sat there and eaten the peanut, it'd be no big deal. But they always get it and they don't want to share it, so they run. And then the other chicken is like, why are they running? And have to go chase them. And it ends up being this huge chase, to own the peanut. And I swear to God that the scrub jays were doing it on purpose just to sow chaos in the yard. And
that's Scrub Jay
unrest.
TV.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just them watching. Yeah, I mean, if you ever want to read an it's aimed at kids. It's like an all ages graphic novel, but First Second has a series of graphic novels called Science Comics, and they have a book on crows, and it's just about how corvids work, and it's really fascinating. It's really interesting to see because corvids include jays, and they include crows, and they include ravens, and they include magpies, and like they are smart as hell, and a lot of times it's like proven that like crows and ravens, for example, when like they get enough food for the day here in Anchorage, like what they'll do is they'll go to places where there's like really good thermal winds, and they'll chase each other, and they'll fly around, and like they'll just like coast because like they actually get joy out of their life. And I do think, I mean, I could see part of the reason why magpies and the treasure thing came from, or where it came from, is because like corvids have like wildly different valuation systems compared to birds or to other birds.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think birds are very, and the fact that they're like the only surviving dinosaurs is pretty amazing.
Yes, that too. But this actually brings up a valuation system question I had. I think one of the most interesting sequences in the entire book so far, Lonesome Hunters, is that number 2 opens with this really lovely 2-page environmental shot, just establishing this new location that we haven't been to. And it's interesting. Like you were talking about how a lot of stories don't value the stuff, like the kind of in-between moments for plot and everything like that. That type of thing, that establishing shot, that 2-page environmental is not something you see a lot of. And it feels very much the way an artist would approach a story if given the freedom to do whatever they wanted, but in a very good way. When you're approaching your own story, like Lonesome Hunters, where you're writing, drawing, coloring, lettering, doing everything yourself, is that a situation where you're thinking more visually and from like a setting the tone standpoint than from a writing one necessarily?
Yes, but I consider that writing.
Sure.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm definitely like the way I write is, well, I'm still sort of new to working on projects at this size, so my process is evolving, but it basically starts with thumbnails, like really, really fast stick figure-y ones, but that's where it starts. And so I'm thinking from the very beginning, like how the pacing works and what I'm going to show and the tone and stuff. And, I read a ton of manga right now, and so much of what makes manga so good is just that they spend so much time on setting and tone and that stuff. And so that's where a lot of that's coming from, I think.
Like I like in the third issue, and this isn't a spoiler, it's just like it starts with here's one of the funny things is I read this on my iPad. So you're drawing for an experience where somebody is being able to flip a book open. and like being able to see both pages together. But with an iPad, like when you're reading like Adobe Acrobat for a PDF, like you're not getting both pages. And it's interesting because like the third page, when you look at, or the third issue, the very first page is just the left half of a bedroom. And I think it's interesting because it's like, I do think that like that, you know, from a writing and drawing and just like storytelling standpoint, like that's a way different valuation system compared to most Western comics, where like that type of stuff wouldn't normally happen, where it's just most of the time it's like when you only have one chance at a first impression, so you're going to want to have like dialogue and stuff happening on that first page. Why is, I mean, beyond the fact that you like manga and you like that type of thing, like why is that sort of slow burn open, the kind of environmental shot, something you value as a storyteller?
Well, I think especially because I work in horror mostly, that like setting tone, atmosphere and tone is like critical to that stuff. And it takes time. I mean, it just takes time to set the tone for stuff, and so you have to commit the page real estate to doing that. Otherwise, you end up relying on just tropes,
jump scares
to get your idea across. Like you'd be like, oh, it's a Frankenstein, so that's the tone, instead of like taking the time to actually build the tone that you want. Just sort of, you can't, like, I don't like to rely on like just saying like, oh, this is a horror comic, so that means it's scary. I like to actually be like, make it like, take the time to build up the scary parts of it, and build up the, what parts have value and what parts don't,
An artist I talked to who also started writing told me once that a writer had told them that when artists try to write, they have a tendency of overwriting because they're not experienced at it. And so it's like you want to like kind of over deliver because like you're not necessarily sure on how exactly the rhythms should work. But one thing I really appreciate about Lonesome Hunters is there's scenes where it feels like you could have dialogue or you could have like something there. But instead, like, a good example is there's this one panel from issue number 3 that is just Howard's surprise expression as he's looking up from like a subway steps. And it's absolutely perfect. It could have dialogue there, but it doesn't. Do you feel like you try to strip down dialogue to let the art do the talking as much as possible, or is it really just situational?
Probably situational. I mean, I try to treat dialogue like as naturally as possible.
Sure.
I don't know if I'm very good at it yet, but that's definitely what I'm shooting for. And I feel like, when you're like running from a magpie, you're not going to be like talking about it. You're just going to be running. I might be
screaming holy shit over and over.
Well, yeah, you might be cussing or whatever, but yeah, you're not going to be like quipping at them or whatever.
Yeah.
You're sort of you got something going on. You're not going to be chatting about it. So that's part of it. I do find that the revision process for me has been like 90% just removing stuff. I think things start off being much more wordy than they end up, and that's one of the dark sides of writing my own stuff is that I end up revising stuff so much. Like I get my really good I do my rough thumbnails and then I do tight thumbnails that could be read by the editor, and I usually do my first like lettering thing on that, and I do like 1 or 2 revisions before I send it into the editor, and then they send me back some notes and stuff, and then I pencil it, and then once I pencil it I revise the lettering and change up the dialogue and tighten it up a little bit, and then once I paint it I go back and I sort of reevaluate the dialogue and check it again, and it almost always just comes down to taking stuff out or turning 2 sentences into one and that sort of stuff.
I always envision like my approach to writing as like making a sculpture. It's like making the statue of David. Obviously, I'm not making the statue of David. I'm making a statue by David. But, you start out with this big block and it's all about reducing. And I think that's kind of like what it sounds like yours is like too, where it's just, I mean, it's easier to edit stuff away than it is to edit stuff in, because normally when you're thinking, you're trying to think tight, you're trying to think like this is what I need to make this work, but adding stuff in when it's like really tight can be difficult, and it's a lot easier to take away, I think.
Yeah, well, and it also like Yeah, at least for me, it's like I'm usually saying stuff that I don't need to say. You know what I mean? Or the characters are saying stuff that they don't need to say.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and it's like, yeah, and it's always just sort of like asking yourself, like, what's the fucking point you're trying to make here? Like, what are you actually trying to get to?
Mm-hmm.
And then just do that. You know what I mean? Don't like, noodle around the thing. Just say the thing.
Right. I could probably use that advice in life, to be honest. I'm a big noodler and getting taking unusual paths to getting my point across, as you can tell as I'm talking.
Mm-hmm.
I just have a couple more questions. I did want to ask about another essential part of your process, watercolors.
Yeah.
That's something you do in Lonesome Hunters. That's something you do elsewhere. I love watercolors to begin with. You're absolutely incredible with them. I'm curious as to why watercolors are your choice. Like, is it just about the result? Is it the process? What is it about watercolors that just feel like the right solution for your work?
It's probably process. Like, I started using watercolors as a sketchbook medium. So when I just wanted to add color in my sketchbook, I would slap down some watercolor because it's really easy. It's hard to like ruin a brush with watercolor because you can always just get it wet and the paint comes off, It's just a really easy sort of medium to sort of do sketching stuff with. So that's where it sort of started. And then I sort of do that in lieu of like digital color just because I hate sitting in front of my computer so much, especially after having done video games for so long. It's like so much nicer to, sit at a desk and look at paper. So yeah, I mean, that's basically it. I mean, it's a fast medium to work in. I find it really fun. I like how it doesn't, you don't have as much control over it as you would with like acrylic or oils or something like that. It's a lot more freewheeling. So you get results that are surprising, like that I find surprising when I'm doing it. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. And I'm just sort of like chasing wherever the painting wants to go sort of a thing, which is always a fun way to work.
It's like happy accidents.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Well, it reminds me of, I remember talking to Michael Lark once and talking to him about inking. And like he said that he had a tough time with digital inking because he wasn't able to recreate those happy accidents, the things that you don't intend to do, but they just happen naturally when you're working with like ink and like a brush and everything.
Yeah.
It's like, it's really hard to recreate like the almost like spontaneity, the spontaneous nature of some of the tools you're using when you're working digitally. And also it's like, the other thing too is there's always the problem. I mean, a lot of people don't have this anymore because they've gotten used to it, but it's like, with digital, I feel like you can chase perfection. And sometimes with like things like watercolor or ink or traditional inking, I feel like sometimes the imperfections are what define it in a positive way.
Yeah. Well, and digital tools have gotten so much better over the years as far as like being able to emulate the happy accidents and the brushes and stuff. But it's always feels like getting that feeling of, natural chaos into a digital tool takes so much more work. It takes so much longer and so much more work than I just go over to my desk and go,
yeah,
and actually get it. You know what I mean? Instead of faking it.
You can also sell your pages at the end of it too.
That's a huge benefit.
I know the original art market has blown up over the last few years, but I imagine having like fully cut or painted or watercolored pages would be like an extreme advantage in a general sense, because people like pencil pages, they like inked pages even more. Having colored pages, woo.
Yeah, and if I could letter on the pages, like, woo, it would be all over.
That would. I mean, you could, but God, your 8-week time frame would all of a sudden become like, oh my God, 16 weeks or something.
Well, and I revise dialogue so much that like I would be a mess.
Oh God, you'd have to redo stuff all the time. You're like, no, I don't like that. White out.
Yeah.
Each page would just be like a half inch of whiteout coming off of it. It would have like a 3D optical effect.
Yeah, exactly. And I've considered doing the balloons on the page and then doing the letters digitally. Mm-hmm. But even that is like, I don't know if that would work for me either.
Yeah. I mean, once it's there, it's kind of there, or like you have to change it and it's going to lead to like a lot of extra work. I mean, I guess that's kind of the upside and the downside of telling your own stories like completely on your own as you're doing it is the upside is you get to do your own story and you get to control all your fate and everything like that. But the downside is it's kind of all on you. And I mean, that even comes down to like, you reached out to me for this chat. When I was doing research, you've done a lot of chats for the Lonesome Hunters, and it seems like you've really been putting in the work. That's one of the things I think people forget about this type of stuff is it's not just like telling your own story. It's like trying to make sure people read it. And like, that's like another job on top of all of this.
Yeah. And it's even more, sort of frustrating too, because, well, I don't know if frustrating is the right word, but it's like like I know that Dark Horse reached out to a lot of podcasts too, and were like, would you like to interview Tyler? And never heard back. And then I would send them an email, and the podcaster would be like, yeah, we'd love to do it. But like they just get because the publishers send out emails all the time.
Yeah.
Like,
get blindness.
And even talking to like trying to get stores to order it. It's like a store will ignore marketing from the publisher, but if the creator reaches out to them, the store will be like, oh, I'm very interested. You know what I mean? Like,
you feel like the belle of the ball. You're like, oh my God, the creator is reaching out directly to me.
Yeah, exactly. And it's it's funny. So it just means that there's a lot of work. And one of the things that's really I'm learning a lot about writing my own stuff is just learning how to talk about a story.
Yeah.
I did not truly appreciate how much I put on all the writers that I work with. Like when we did interviews together, like there would be a question about a plot or a character, and I'm like, Cullen Bunn can answer that one. Yeah, he knows what's up with that. I'll let him do that. And now I'm like, oh my God, I have to answer this now? I'm the guy?
Yeah, it's all on you. It's all on you. I mean, I've read a lot of interviews in my day. And, the other thing, too, is like if you get the same question over and over, how do you keep making that interesting, both to yourself and to the people who read or listen to it?
Uh-huh. No, and it's like I still don't know what's a spoiler and what's not.
Oh, right.
Don't know where to find that line. And, I really, like I said, I really appreciate the writers I've worked with in the past, because there's like Cullen in particular, I think is really good at like just pitching a story and telling someone like, oh, here's what the story's about. And I find myself like doing the thing where it's like, what's Lonesome Hunters about? And I'm like, well, it's kind of about, there's like a magic sword and there's this guy, it's an old guy, but really the story's about like this guy and this girl and how they're sort of friends now, I guess. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I fall into that thing when people just want to be like, that's about a magic sword fighting a magpie. Like that's
all we need.
Yeah, that's all we need. Like,
yeah. It is tough. I mean, I do think that your Lone Wolf and Cub meets Preacher elevator pitch, those things always help people understand this stuff. It's just a shortcut. But
yeah,
I do want to close. This is like a bigger question that I'm curious about. But from what I understand, you've really been focused on telling your own stories, or at the very least, your own types of stories, like ones that are interesting to you. Because it's not like you want to have a legacy or something, but it's you want to know that you spent your time doing something that was important to you. And I think that's great.
Yeah.
I mean, like that's an ideal goal for anybody. Do you feel like that shift in focus has led to any growth for you as a creator, an increase in like investment in what you're doing, if you will?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Like, I don't feel like I feel like my career in comics, with every project, I'm sort of like focusing on learning something new. You know what I mean? Like I'm always, and I guess this sort of tracks through like even my video game and graphic design careers. Like I always sort of am wanting to learn something new. And this feels like just an extension of that. Just trying to do that. And also like every book that I've worked on, I've tried as hard as I can to put as much of myself into it as I can, and really try to, even when I'm working with a writer, I'm still like doing a lot of the work of figuring out motivations for characters and making sure that is expressed as clearly as possible through the art and stuff like that. And so it's like a lot of it is the same process day to day. The writing process is the part that I think is new and is making me sort of like reflect on a lot of well, like I said this in another interview, but I'm taking everything that I'm like super stressed out about and like cramming it into the Lonesome Hunters. And so there's a lot of, self-reflection and stuff that I'm thinking about involved in that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, I think every story is a reflection of the people who tell it. And if you didn't put yourself in there, I think you'd probably be doing yourself a disservice in some ways.
Yeah, no, it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, I definitely know writers who are like, who take the approach that there are, they're just writing, character X and they're doing it for a paycheck and they're just trying to come up with a fun read and not really trying to do, they're not trying to, they're not trying to make, they're not trying to write their opus or anything. They're just trying to, they're just doing their job. And I think that as, working like that as a craftsperson, I think is perfectly fine. Like that's a fine way to go through your day. But I definitely want to feel like when I'm done that I've said something that is meaningful to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you're accomplishing that now with The Lonesome Hunters. It's a great book. Everyone should read it. Issue 2 is out. Issue 3 is coming out shortly. But Tyler, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about The Lonesome Hunters, NFL Game Day, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
It's my pleasure, man. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Tyler Crook. You can find Crook on Twitter at Mr. Tyler Crook and his work in The Lonesome Hunters at Dark Horse. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast today on Apple Podcasts and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow it on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uritem, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Rom V, Devin Fitzsimons, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Warren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Norb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Brian, Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Bawan, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillos, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Pula, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiamping, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grubeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mayazel, Akil Wilson, Alex Demetriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwand, Vita Ayala, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Ching, Cole McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.